Focus on Aging Adults is sponsored in part by AARP.
Pennsylvania has one of the largest aging populations in the country. Our aging adults are vibrant, active contributors to our society. PCN, in partnership with AARP, present Focus on Aging Adults.
Welcome to Focus on Aging Adults. I'm Larry Casper. This program is brought to you in partnership between PCN and the AARP of Pennsylvania. Today we're talking about how voters age 50 and older can influence the outcome of the November general election. AARP of Pennsylvania commissioned a poll that was conducted by Bob Ward of Fabrizio Ward and Jeff Liszt from Impact Research. We also have Bill Johnston-Walsh, the state director of AARP. Bill, how big a role are older voters in Pennsylvania playing in next month's presidential election?
Great. Thank you, Larry. Appreciate having me here today. They play a huge role. In past years, we've heard over and over again from our members. We have 1.8 million members here in Pennsylvania, and then a large group of 50-plus voters. In the last election, over 60% of those that voted were over the age of 50. So that is a strong block of voters. And the candidates must be listening to them and the issues that are important to them across the board. And that's why AARP has done this poll, the one we have right now that just came out at the beginning of October, and the one we did back in April, May, to really highlight what it is that is on the minds and is important to the 50-plus voter.
And Bill, as a person gets older, just how do their concerns and priorities change?
Well, sometimes they change, sometimes they don't. I just think as you get older, especially if you're over the age of 65, economically, you might be retired, you might be on a fixed income. So you don't have that cash flow that's coming in that you're used to. Your health you're a bigger consumer of healthcare, aren't you? Exactly, huge consumer of healthcare as you age. So these are the issues that are most important to them. So we hear a lot, and you'll hear today from Bob and Jeff, that economic pocketbook issues are very important to the 50 plus. You'll hear that healthcare is important, Social Security. And the financial well-being of Social Security is very important. And you'll also hear about Medicare and some of those key issue areas. So yes, as you age, you still have some of the same values that you had as you were younger, but then there are some key issue areas that really impact you in your day-to-day life that are going to be forefront.
And as far as you can tell, Bill, just how much are the candidates trying to appeal to older voters this time around, maybe contrasted to 2020?
I think that we've been doing a poll like this over the last two cycles, back in 22 and 20, and we believe that we are out there pushing these issues to the candidates. We're contacting the candidates' teams at all levels, at the federal level, state level, and local level.
And the candidates are engaging back with AARP?
They are engaging back. They see the importance. We remind them of this voting block and how important it is. And you can tell from what we're hearing back from them, what we're seeing in their ads across the state, and how they're really changing their tune with regards to making sure the focus is on the economic pieces as well as hitting the Social Security and Medicare pieces.
And what were the questions? I mean, it occurs to me before you commission any poll, some questions must rise to the top of your mind. In this case, given this election next month, what were those questions you really wanted to explore with the AARP constituency?
Sure. We worked with Bob and Jeff to really come up with these questions. We at AARP Pennsylvania, we see what's happening on the ground. Bob and Jeff are seeing what's happening across the nation with regards to some trends that are going on. So we wanted to make sure that we hit on those economic issues, the kitchen table issues that impact individuals. We wanted to look at what are some of the other key issue areas that are happening right now across the country, whether it be immigration, whether it be women's issues, whether it be safety issues. And then healthcare was a big one. Then we also wanted to make sure that we were hitting on, looking at the numbers. I think everybody wants to know who might be ahead or who might be behind.
Right.
And we're doing that at the federal level with the presidential race and the federal Senate race, and we're doing that at some state level races as well.
We're going to include Jeff and Bob in this discussion in a minute, but first, tell me how AARP of Pennsylvania went about choosing these two entities to do the poll for you.
Well, they're great polling firms. They're well respected, and at AARP we are nonpartisan. We don't endorse individuals. We endorse. I always tell people we endorse policies, not people. And then also we don't have a PAC. We don't give money out. Our strength is in our membership. We have 38 million members across the country, and as I mentioned earlier, we have 1.8 million here, and they are active individuals that are following these elections. With Bob, on the Republican side, they do a lot with regards to the Trump campaign and some other key races. And same thing on the Democratic side. Jeff does a lot with the Harris and before that the Biden people. So we wanted to make sure that we had a balanced look at this poll and both of these pollsters are very well respected across the country.
Well, now let's turn to Jeff and Bob, and they're joining us on Zoom. Jeff, start us off. How are the people selected to participate in this poll?
Well, the most important thing is that the people were selected randomly. And that's how we know that their opinions are going to be representative of the opinions of voters in Pennsylvania more broadly. And we not only select them at random, we make sure that we contact them using multiple modes. So some people are called on a landline by a live interviewer. Some people are called on a mobile phone by a live interviewer. Some people are getting a link in a text message that they can use to take the survey. We don't want to limit ourselves to just one methodology. We want to use what is really the gold standard methodology that you would be using if you were on the Harris campaign or the Trump campaign or any number of.
It sounds like you want to include the popular modes of communication in order to get a good sample.
That's right. I mean, for a long time, you could conduct a really good survey just by calling everyone on a landline.
Right, that's how it was done. That's all you had.
For a while, then you could conduct a really good survey just by calling everyone on a mobile phone because everybody had a mobile phone. But these days, you have to reach out to people in multiple ways and over multiple days if you really want to represent the electorate accurately.
Bob, how big a sample was taken in order for this to be truly representative?
We interviewed just under 1,400 voters in Pennsylvania. It's 1,398. But we have three different samples that we were aiming to interview. So the statewide look, sort of how the election is going in Pennsylvania. We have a 600 sample survey of likely voters age 18 plus throughout the state. We also have an observable sample of 800 likely voters age 50 and older. And then the third sample we look at, we have a 400 sample survey of African-American likely voters age 50 and older. So we want to be able to look into each of those universes and see what they're thinking about how the election's going and the issues. And so that's why we have three different samples here.
So, Bob, how did you decide to make part of your sample? You polled a total of 1,400 people, and there was a majority, 800 for 50 plus. How did you decide to have that number? How do you make it just right by dividing the pie into certain size slices?
Right. So I think it's important to know that just because we have the larger sample size of older voters, when we're looking at the overall numbers from the survey, we weight those older voters down into the proportion that they should be in the electorate. So when we say among all voters, Harris is getting X percent and Trump's getting Y percent, it's not overcounting older voters. So I think it's important to say that. But how we choose our sample size really depends on how much we want to look into it. So sample size really is a function of opening up the hood and looking underneath. And so if we want to look at, suburban women versus rural men, We need to have enough sample to do that. And so because our focus here is really zooming in on the older voter, they got the bigger sample. But the statewide sample of 600 voters is a pretty adequate sample, and it gives us a pretty accurate view of what voters in Pennsylvania are looking at.
And I think, Larry, the other thing that we hear on the ground, and I tell Bob and Jeff this all the time, is that when we give this out to the candidates and their teams and other influencers around the state, they really take a look at this because it is one of the largest polls that are done with the most individuals. It's not under 1,000. It's not like 200. They're not just going out there and talking to 200 people. They're talking to well over 1,000 people and really getting a good sample of what people are thinking about in Pennsylvania.
And that group of 800 is, of course, of particular interest to AARP, the older voter.
Exactly.
Jeff, did you ask the participants about their party affiliation?
Yes, I mean, Pennsylvania is a very closely divided state in terms of partisanship, and 43% of these respondents say that they're Democrats, 40% say that they're Republicans, and 16% say that they're independents. Those numbers are a little bit different among the voters 50 plus. Among the 50 plus, it's 44% who say they're Republicans, 41% who say they're Democrats, and 15% who say that they're independents. So the state overall is 3 points more Democrats than Republicans, but over 50 plus voters are 44 to 41 Republicans, so 3 points more Republican.
Now, again, concentrate. Go ahead. Who was that? Was that Bob?
Sorry,
sorry, Jeff.
I should say also that just because somebody says that they're a Democrat or says that they're a Republican in general doesn't mean that that's the only party that they're voting for. And in fact, you have a lot of ticket splitters among those voters 50 plus. 27% of voters 50 plus are not voting straight ticket Republican, not voting straight ticket Democrat, but they're voting, it could be Republican in one race, undecided in another, Democrat in one race, Republican in another. So there really are a lot of persuadable voters over age 50 and enough to decide any of the contests in Pennsylvania.
And again, concentrating on voters age 50 and up that you polled, a question was asked, how many of them are motivated to vote? And I recall seeing, at least to a layman's eyes, it looked like a very high number of 50-plussers motivated to vote. Who can expand on that?
I'll jump in on that one. This is one that we've been tracking over time, and there is still a big difference in motivation between 50-plus voters and under 50 voters in Pennsylvania. It's 20 points higher among older voters than younger voters. So 91% of voters 50 plus are extremely motivated to vote, and only 71% of voters under 50 are extremely motivated to vote. And as you go up in age groups, the lowest motivation to vote is voters 18 to 34. 67% of them are extremely motivated, and the most motivated group to vote is seniors 65 plus. 93% of them are extremely motivated.
Now, again, 91% sounds high to me, but you fellas have the polling experience. Did that strike you as especially high?
Well, I think the disparity between older and younger voters is interesting. This is our second poll in Pennsylvania, and what we know is as you get closer to the election, motivation about voting rises. And so we saw that. And that's true among both older and younger voters. But the gap between older and younger voters persists. And so, no, I'm not surprised to see a 91% extremely motivated to vote number among voters 50 plus, because we know they show up. What I think this data about vote motivation is important to realize is if I'm a pollster looking at this race and I see what the results are overall, and I know that there's a good chunk of the voters who may not be as motivated as another segment of the electorate, what that's telling me is that there's a likelihood, a possibility that those younger voters don't show up in the numbers in which they are showing up in our survey. And so who does that give the advantage to? As Jeff mentioned, older voters do have a more Republican lean to them. And so as I look at the very close races in Pennsylvania, if younger voters don't show up in the numbers which they're showing up in our survey because of their slightly less motivation to vote, that advantages Republican candidates in Pennsylvania.
And I think the other thing too, adding on to what Bob was talking about, if you looked at the first poll that we did, even then, 85%.
That was April?
That was in April. 85% of those 50 plus were, and that only grew to 91% over the 50 plus, in a couple months' time. It also shows that the older Pennsylvania is paying attention all year long. Most voters really, and I think either Jeff or Bob said this earlier, most voters aren't paying attention until after Labor Day. It's not something that's important to them. They're going on with their lives. I think older voters are looking at what the candidates are saying early on in the year, asking the questions, making and following what they're saying, and that hasn't happened as much with younger voters.
So I can't get over that number, fellas. 91% of voters age 50 and up. 91%. Bill, how did that strike you? Did that surprise you in any way when you saw it?
No, not at all, because again, the numbers that I talked about earlier, over 60%.
It just grew from April, didn't it?
It grew from April, and it grew from past years, and it doesn't surprise me. This election is going to be impactful. What the candidates are saying at all levels about the economy and what they're saying about Social Security and Medicare really do count, because it's hitting those individuals on a day-to-day basis, hitting their lives, hitting their family lives. So it does not surprise me at all.
Jeff and Bob, what did the poll reveal about people of color? Was that a subdivision of your poll going into next month's election?
Yes, absolutely. There are a lot of differences in Pennsylvania, including among older voters. There are differences between men and women, more and less educated. But one of the big differences is white voters versus black voters in Pennsylvania. So white voters and black voters are both extremely motivated to vote if they're over 50. 92% of white voters over 50 are extremely motivated. 86% of black voters over 50 are extremely motivated. And older black voters are the core of Kamala Harris's support. She's leading by 80 points with black voters over 50. But Donald Trump is leading by 20 points with white voters over 50. So there's a big difference there.
Did you further subdivide people of color into age groups?
Yes, we did. So as I mentioned, we had this 400 sample survey of African-American voters 50 plus, and we see some differences. For example, we see differences between those in the what we would say seniors, those over age 65, are among Kamala Harris's strongest voter groups. 96% of African-American voters 65 plus are voting for Harris. The age group just below that, voters age 50 to 64, while they're still overwhelmingly voting for Harris, the margin is a little narrower, right? So they are voting for Harris 81%, but 12% of them are voting for Trump. So that's a 69-point margin versus a 94-point margin among the seniors. So there are some demographic differences here, less so by gender, but we have women, African-American women age 50 plus, voting strongly for Harris, 88% to 7, 90% to 5. And then men, 50 plus, African-American men, 85% to 10. So there's a gap there, a 10-point gap in favor of women, stronger for Harris. So there are differences. It's not a monolith.
And I think the other thing too, talking about the women, one of the things that we've been seeing in Pennsylvania is that suburban women are riled up. We're seeing that outside of Philadelphia. We're seeing that outside of Pittsburgh. We're just seeing that in general across the state. And to me, I'd like to see that, because one of the key issue areas that they're riled up about is caregiving. Caregiving is these are a lot of sandwich generation women that are raising their children, taking care of an elderly parent or an elderly person in their community, and they're stressed, and they're seeing this. Obviously there's some other factors that are playing into this as well, but from our standpoint, we've really been really focused on that. Actually, over the last 2 days, we had these suburban women roundtables. We had one in Philadelphia and one in Pittsburgh. And just the discussion, and we really balanced it. There was about 10 to 12 women at each one, and half were Republican, well, almost half were Republican, almost half were Democrat, and then we threw a couple independents in there as well. And there was a great conversation between them, on key issue areas that are really impacting them. And we just saw that the one thing I was happy about, it was a cordial conversation, unlike maybe some others that have happened around the country, but they really but they were passionate about their beliefs and what they were thinking.
And how did you find these women, Bill? These particular women to participate?
How did we find them?
Yeah, they must have represented certain blocks.
They did. We basically went out within the communities. We had our teams go out there, work with some of our partners. We worked with the Chamber of Commerce, with the Democratic groups, with the Republican groups, to see who would like to come and really talk about things that are impacting them as women, as older women in the suburban areas around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And we were able to find them, and they were willing to share their story and about why this election is important to them, and what issues are important to them as well.
And a minute ago, Jeff and Bob were talking about the part of the poll that addressed people of color, and certainly here at PCN we like to see as many people vote as possible. So it occurs to me to ask you, Bill, is AARP engaged in any kind of campaign to motivate people of color to cast a vote?
We're doing it across the state for all individuals. What we're doing is we're basically have a campaign throughout this whole year about how to vote, where to vote, when to vote. In Pennsylvania, we do have mail-in balloting. We do have absentee balloting. We make sure that people know it could be a little tricky at times. You got to do a couple signatures, both inside and on the envelope. So we are looking at social media. We're talking to the press. We're going out there at events across the state, letting people know where their polling places are, who to contact. So yes, we've been making sure that it's a right that everyone has, and we think that everyone should vote, no matter their age, 18 and above. And we just believe that people should have the resources to be able to do that. So at AARP, we were really pushing that with how to vote, where to vote, and when to vote throughout the course of the year.
So, gentlemen, let's get into the issues that were addressed in the poll. In other words, if you're a voter age 50 and up, what are you thinking about? What is foremost in your mind before you cast your vote?
Well, I'll take that one. I think the big issue that is defining the 2024 election in Pennsylvania and in a lot of other states, quite frankly, is the economy. And older voters are telling us, well, first, they're not happy. 2/3 of older voters in Pennsylvania say the country's heading in the wrong direction. 2/3 of older voters in Pennsylvania say they're worried about their personal financial situation. Mm-hmm. And so I think that sort of sets the table of the mood of this election. And then we ask voters, we give them a list of actually 13 issues we go through. Ask them to pick what's their number one issue, and then if they pick one, what's their second most important issue that's going to help decide their vote this fall. At the top of that list of 13 is immigration and border security. This is an issue, it's a cultural issue that is really important for Republican older voters. It's also important for a good number of independent older voters, far less important for Democratic older voters. But right behind that, you've got issues like inflation, you've got issues like the economy and jobs. These economic issues play a big role. They're the second and third. And then if I would take those two issues and add Social Security to it, and that's sort of an issue bucket of personal economic issues for older voters, that adds up to 62% of older Pennsylvania voters picking that one of those issues as either their top one or two. And that's big among Republicans, it's big among independents, and it's big among Democrats. So I think the economy really is the defining issue. I mentioned the cultural issue of immigration and border security for Republicans. On the flip side, there's cultural issues for older Democrats. Abortion and reproductive issues is the single most important issue among older Democrats when we look at that list of 13 issues, followed by threats to democracy. And so both sides have these cultural motivating issues, but bridging the gap across all partisans is this focus on the economy. And I think that's why you hear candidates talking about economic issues a lot. It's what's on voters' minds.
What about Medicare,
right.
Bob? Did that appear on your list anywhere?
I'm sorry, Larry, I didn't get that.
What about Medicare? Did that appear on your list of top issues?
Yeah, so Medicare wouldn't fall in one of those issues where it's like my number one issue. But when we ask people specifically how important is Medicare in deciding your vote, we've got a whopping 77% of older Pennsylvania voters say it is at least very important. 40% say it's extremely important. So while it may not be at the top of the list, it's absolutely there in voters' minds. And so when candidates are talking about Medicare, older voters are absolutely listening.
Now let's talk about a constituency that would obviously be of interest to AARP of Pennsylvania, and that has to do with caregivers. And I understand that that was somehow worked into your poll. What did you discover about family caregivers in the poll? Jeff, can you help us with that?
Sure. The first thing that we found out is that a lot of older voters are family caregivers. You've got 29% of older voters who are currently caring for an older or ill adult or someone with a disability. And you've got even more older voters who say that the issue of helping seniors age independently at home is either extremely or very important to them. And for these family caregivers, the people who are currently doing that job, it's a lot of unpaid work. For about half of them, it's more than 10 hours a week. For a lot of them, it's more than 20 hours a week. And then, as I said, even if you're not currently a family caregiver, almost all older voters will tell you that family caregiving and helping seniors age independently at home is either extremely or very important in how they're going to vote. And those voters, those older voters who are prioritizing family caregiving, they're an extremely competitive group, splitting their tickets in the presidential and the U.S. Senate race, for example. So family caregiving is an issue that not only matters a lot to older voters, it matters across party lines, and it's an issue that represents a real opportunity for candidates on either side to make inroads with older voters.
And Bill, we know the role of caregiver is tough anyway because caregivers often have their own responsibilities and their own full-time jobs too.
That's exactly right. Jeff's right on point, and I was glad to see that came up in the poll because we see that all the time. There's over 2 million caregivers, and most of them are unpaid caregivers within the state of Pennsylvania. And we just, as I mentioned earlier, with the suburban women and women in general, they tend to be the caregivers. They're the ones that have to be in the sandwich generation, and it is stressful. So one of the things that AARP is always looking at is how we can get some numbers like this, so we can talk to legislators to see how we can get some resources in there to support caregivers. Is always important to us.
Well, now that we've established that caregivers is an important block here, it's significant. Just what does this group need from our next president? Can we look at it in those terms? What do they want?
Yeah, well, I think they tell us. Oh, sorry.
No, go right ahead, Bob.
Go ahead, Bob. You have the floor.
Yes. Okay. So, we asked voters, older voters in Pennsylvania, a few things about family caregiving to see if they would support a candidate who took that position. To give, to answer your question, what do they want?
Yeah.
We found that more than 3/4 of older voters would be more likely to vote for a candidate who would support family care, support family caregivers who are helping to age their aging loved ones to age in place at home. And specifically, 71% would support providing paid leave for unpaid family caregivers. And 71% would also be more likely to vote for a candidate who would say they'd provide a tax credit for these expenses that they incur taking care of their loved ones. And I think the important thing here is these numbers are really big. And what that tells you is that, and the data says this, is that these numbers are high whether you're a Republican, an independent, or Democrat. Thing is, it doesn't matter what party you are, everyone has parents and everyone is looking for some help in this very burdensome and emotional job they've taken on.
And a lot of parents want to remain in their homes as long as they can, Bill. We often talk about that.
Yeah, totally. That's livable communities and being able to do that. And as caregivers are able to keep their families close by within their community, within their families is very important to us and to them.
Now, another kitchen table issue here, I think, is just something that everybody can relate to, and that's the cost of utilities. Was that addressed in the poll? Because that could be a source of financial stress, for sure.
It definitely was. We asked actually a couple questions. So first we asked, just sort of in general, older voters, because we know inflation and rising prices, I mentioned that was the number 2 issue on our list. And so we said, what are your biggest cost concerns? Food was at the top of the list, but right behind it was utilities. And that is a major cost concern. And then we ask another question: how important is the cost of utilities in deciding your vote this fall? 70% of older Pennsylvania voters say that the cost of utilities was at least very important to them. And over a third, 36%, say it's extremely important to them. So cost of utilities is a big issue. It's right up there with, other sort of daily costs like food and cost of medicines.
And we see
that's right. And I'll add that if you're over 65, utilities are the number 1 concern, higher even than food costs.
Yeah, and Bob and Jeff, that's what we see on the ground every day. When we do surveys here in the state, one of asking people about how are they going to be able to stay in their homes as long as possible? Utilities, property tax, upkeep, all of those things are number 1. So it did not surprise me at all to see that so high on the list because, again, survey after survey, we find that people say, yeah, I want to stay in the home that I raised my family in. And in order to do that, I can't be every year getting higher and higher utility bills or higher and higher property tax it just doesn't make sense, and it will force me out of my home.
One more question about the issues, fellas, before we get into the candidates and what your poll reflected there. What about the cost of prescription drugs? And often that's something that recurs on this program. Was that addressed in your poll?
We know that the cost of prescription drugs matters a lot to older voters. In this survey, the cost of prescription drugs was a major concern. It was on par, for example, with seniors with food. It was slightly behind the cost of utilities. But we also know that 66% of older Pennsylvania voters tell us that the cost of prescription drugs is either extremely or very important to them. That's part of the reason why you have 83% of older voters who want Medicare to continue negotiating for lower prescription drug prices. You only have 6% who would prefer a member of Congress who's going to stop Medicare from negotiating. And you don't get up to 83% without having strong support among Democrats, independents, and Republicans. So Medicare negotiating for lower prescription drug prices is not a partisan issue among older voters.
Okay, gentlemen, let's get into the candidates now. After all, the horse race aspect is always of interest to our viewers. So, among voters age 50 plus, what does your poll say about the race for president?
Well, it's a very close race. It's a toss-up between Kamala Harris, who's at 49% among all voters, and 47% for Donald Trump. So a 2-point lead for Harris. But among older voters, Trump has the advantage. He is leading by 8 points. Trump's at 52%, as the slide just said, and Harris at 44%. So older voters in Pennsylvania, we know, are more Republican, and that's showing in their support for their preferred candidate for president.
So what about women age 50 plus? Who are they favoring for president?
It's a dead heat. Women 50 plus, 48% are voting for Harris and 48% are voting for Trump. It's a toss-up, and that is going to be a real battleground in this last month of the campaign, is trying to connect with older women in Pennsylvania. Both campaigns are going to be zeroed in on that.
That's right, and that's a dynamic that has been important since Biden was the nominee. It was a 2-point race among women 50 plus in Pennsylvania back in April when we looked at Biden, and it's a tied race now among women 50 plus with Harris versus Trump. You've pretty consistently had big leads for Trump with older men, but the older women are extremely competitive and one of the main battlegrounds to decide the state that is the main battleground in the whole country.
Now, when Biden exited the race, how much did that shake up this whole contest? I'm sure pollsters were watching that.
Oh, it changed the race very much. It did here in Pennsylvania. And we have the two polls, the one from April, where Biden was at the top of the ticket, and of course, this poll, current poll, where Harris is at the top of the ticket. We had Trump ahead by 5 points over Biden back in April, and now Harris is ahead by 2. So we have a net shift of 7 points. One of the things we saw was sort of an evaporation of the third party vote. So you had a lot of Democrats sitting on the sidelines, putting their vote at a third party placeholder. But once the ticket changed, they came home. And so now we see pretty good party consolidation. Both Democrats, 88% of Democrats voting for Harris and 90% of Republicans voting for Trump. And that wasn't the case back in April. So it really did sort of shift the race quite a bit with the change in the ticket. It's such an unusual event.
And how about voters who are still undecided at this late stage? Again, our focus being on voters age 50 and up.
Let's see, so you don't have many voters who are undecided in Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. You've only got 3% or so who are undecided. Mm-hmm. on the full ballot for president.
So again, given your experience, fellas, that's not much. 3%, not significant.
Right, it's 3%
it's
overall.
Enough to switch the race.
Right. That when you get into it's 3% of the under 50. It's 3% of the over 50. But I think that when I look at these results, I focus a little more on the ticket splitters than I do on the undecided, because the ticket splitters, the voters who are not voting straight party Republican, not voting straight party Democrat, right? They really could go either way in a lot of these contests. There are 27% of voters 50 plus who are splitting their ticket between the presidential, the Senate, and the various other ballots that we tested. And that's enough votes just among those ticket splitters over age 50 to decide any of the contests in Pennsylvania. So that's really what I'm focused on. Those ticket splitters tend to be focused very much on the personal economic issues that Bob was talking about earlier, and that includes Social Security.
Mm-hmm. And the literal straight ticket is defunct here in Pennsylvania anyway. Now you have to concentrate on each race individually and not just throw one switch for multiple candidates.
And yet many voters do. Most voters in Pennsylvania, when we ask them, for all the races that we test, how are you going to vote? And there's a good number of folks, particularly among older voters in Pennsylvania. What is it? Let's see, 40% of older voters say they're gonna vote Republican on every single race, and then there's 34% they're going to vote Democrat on every single race. Mm-hmm. So yes, they have to do it one at a time, but they're telling us that they're going to be straight ticket voters. And I think Jeff's point that there's 27% of older voters who aren't doing that, who are moving around. They may be undecided on one or voting Republican on one and Democrat on another. That is who campaigns are focused on. And what our data is clearly telling us is that the economy is the number one issue for them, and that includes Social Security.
Bill, what do you get out of what Jeff and Bob just told us about this race for president?
What I get out of it is that it's a nail biter, as they said. It's a toss-up here in Pennsylvania. It shows that Pennsylvanians, especially the 50-plus, are looking at the issues, and as Bob just said, they're looking at the economic issues, pocketbook issues, kitchen table issues that are impacting them on a day-to-day basis. One of the things that was mentioned is food, the food piece of it. Of the 13 questions, food was one. How does food prices impact you? That has gone up 5 points. The other interesting thing I noticed too, that the gas question about does gas prices impact you has gone down 5 points.
Right.
Again, since the April poll. And so again, people are following what's impacting them right now. And as from my perspective and AARP's perspective, we just have to make sure that people are getting the information, that the candidates are getting this poll and letting them know what's important to the 50 plus, and hopefully they will be able to, if elected, be able to again support these issues that are important to all older Pennsylvanians.
The candidates can try to take some action after they look at your poll.
Hopefully, yeah. You've seen a little bit of that, in some of the ads that have been going on across the state here. We have noticed that.
So let's move on to another race, Jeff and Bob. We just talked about president. What about U.S. Senate here in Pennsylvania? That's Dave McCormick and Bob Casey. As far as our core constituency here is concerned, voters age 50 and up, what did you find?
Well, among older voters, Dave McCormick has a 5-point lead over Senator Casey. And that's, goes to the older voter being, leaning more Republican in every one of these races that we look at, including the Senate race. The Republican has the advantage. Among older voters, there's a gender gap. And so Senator Casey's got a 3-point lead among older women. McCormick has a 13-point lead among older men. So there's differences within the voting bloc of older voters, but it's McCormick has the advantage, even though Casey has the advantage overall in the race, where he's ahead 4 points statewide.
Well, Casey is the status quo, and he's the incumbent. He's been in office for many years, so it seems surprising that McCormick could have the advantage among older voters.
Yes, although if we look, compare it to the presidential race, so Trump has the advantage by 8 points among older voters, and McCormick's advantage is 3 points lower than that. He has a 5-point lead over his opponent, Casey. So Casey is, among older voters, while he's still behind, he's overperforming Trump among older voters.
And I think again that shows that since Casey is the incumbent, AARP has worked with him and his team over the years. One of the things that Casey is the chair of the Special Committee on Aging. So to me, that shows yes, he has worked on some of these issues, but he's not doing a good job of getting that across to the older Pennsylvanian that says, yes, I do care about these issues. I do care about Social Security. It's not coming across, in my opinion. And Dave McCormick is doing a better job of saying, Social Security is important to him, and he's doing that. So, and again, I'm going off of the ads and what we're seeing.
Sure.
So that's the way that most people are getting their information in these sound bites across the election cycle.
And we all know the ads are on TV dozens of times a day, over and over and over.
Exactly.
And I would just say, I think it's working. If we look at our April poll among older voters, Casey had a net favorable image of 14 points. Today, among older voters, Casey's net favorable image is underwater by 5 points. And so that's a pretty big shift over the several months between those two polls.
So that's interesting, Bill, what you said. Casey has to let the voters know that he is, in fact, engaged in these issues, but it sounds like they just don't know.
They don't. from what we're hearing on the ground, when we'd say that, and our team was out there and we're talking about the issues, and then we'll just mention that, we worked with the legislators, Republican and Democrats, and we've worked with Senator Casey on this issue. They're like, oh, and he's the chair of the Special Committee on Aging, had not a clue, didn't know, and they seem surprised. And we hear that over and over again because that information is not getting out there to the electorate.
Let's look at another major race here, gentlemen, that of PA Attorney General. And the candidates there are Eugene DePasquale and Dave Sunday. Jeff and Bob, what did you find there?
Right. Well, that's another extremely close race. I feel like a broken record talking about these contests in Pennsylvania. We found that DePasquale had been down by 1 point in the April poll among all voters, but is ahead by 3 points now among all voters. If you look at the 50-plus voter, that's a 7-point margin.
I wonder what changed, Jeff.
By 7 points there.
I wonder what changed since April.
Casey.
Sorry, Jeff, I wonder what changed since April. Maybe, Bill, you can get us going on that. If there's been a change since April, what's changed in these campaigns that can account for the change in numbers? Anyone for that matter. Jeff or Bob, you too.
Well, I would say, we don't ask about how many voters know DePasquale or Sunday, but as for a down ticket race like this, candidates are going to get more well known. Campaigns are run. Candidates will tell you about them and they'll tell you about their opponents. So what's changed from now and April is campaigns have happened, and more people are aware of who these candidates are and what they're standing for.
It can simply be an increase in awareness, huh, Bob?
Yes.
I think there's that, and then also Eugene DePasquale did run at least 1 or 2 statewide races. So his name is out there. Dave Sunday is the York DA right now. Very well liked in the center part of the state, but I don't know if his name recognition goes to the east in Philadelphia and to the west and to the Pittsburgh and the western part of the state. So as Bob just said, I think over time, both of them with their commercials have been getting their name out there as well on the ground with their workers as well as in the air with the media.
Jeff and Bob,
I think Democrats were also a little bit in the doldrums in April when we did the first survey. Republicans were much more motivated to vote in general in Pennsylvania than Democrats were. So you saw a 9-point advantage for Republicans in motivation, and now the parties are basically even. So I think that Democrats are also just generally benefiting from a little bit more motivation since the change at the top of the ticket.
Let's consider one more race here statewide, gentlemen. What does your poll say about the race for PA Treasurer? That's the race with Stacey Garrity and Erin McClellan. What did you find?
I sound like a broken record. Another very close
Sorry,
race.
you have no choice. You have to report the numbers. We have no control.
Yeah. So overall, Garrity's ahead by a point at 45%. McClellan's at 44%. And so an extremely close race. Less close among older voters, where Garrity has an 8-point lead. But that race is really up for grabs.
Mm-hmm. And that's another one where you've got big differences between older women and older men. You've got big differences between college and non-college educated voters. You've got big differences between urban, suburban, and rural voters. So the treasurer's race is another contest that's showing a lot of the fault lines within Pennsylvania that are adding up to this close race.
Bill, a number of times we've used the word awareness. Awareness is increasing in recent weeks for this election. And I understand AARP has an election guide. So what's in that guide?
So the election guide, basically we make sure that we put the polls in there, the 2 polls that we did. We talk about the how to vote, where to vote, when to vote. We talk about links. We put links in there to the Department of State, AARP, has some key information on dates that are in there that are important for
when you have to register.
When you have to register, when's the last day to get your mail-in ballot, when can you, what day can you put your mail-in ballot to. Those are all key things that are in this guide. We also list out like who the candidates are running for the different offices and what offices are up. You know, as we just mentioned, there are 3 row offices up. The entire state house is up. Half of the Senate is up, and obviously we have the federal Senate race as well as the top of the ticket, you know, with the presidential race. So we really list as much information and give as much guidance for people to go and get information on those key issues.
So the voting guide has important dates, and certainly that's useful. What about, are there any changes to voting procedure? Is there anything anybody should know this time around that's different than last time?
It's not that it's different. You know, there's been a lot of court cases going back and forth, but the main thing that people have to do is if they're going to be doing mail-in balloting.
Court cases about mail-in balloting.
Yes, for the most part, and they have to realize that they have to follow the directions. They have to realize that you just don't fill out the inside of the paper. You have to sign the inside. You have to date it. Then you have to make sure that you put it in the correct envelope. You seal the envelope. You have an envelope
within an envelope.
Exactly, and you have to sign that envelope with your signature across the seal on the back of it.
So all those boring administrative things you don't want to do, you got to do.
Exactly, and there's some, and we saw from the last election that there were quite a few that were not counted because they didn't follow the steps. So at AARP, when I talk about,
now we account for these court cases.
Exactly. So when I talk about how to vote, where to vote, when to vote, the how to vote is just as important about where you're going to either go or for your polling place. These different pieces. So we try our best to make sure that information is out there and that people know how to vote.
And Bill, how much are older voters latching on to the concept of mail-in voting? Still, I guess you could say it's still relatively new. It's been in Pennsylvania for a few years now.
It's just been through a few election cycles. Yes. It's growing, but you'll see, I think in the poll, and Bob and Jeff could probably answer this better than I, even though older voters do use mail-in balloting quite a bit, I still think a lot of them like to go to their polling place, and they like to know that I pulled the lever or I pushed the button, and my vote's going to count.
It's a connection with the community.
Exactly.
You're seeing people you know. How about that, Jeff and Bob? What do you know about how much mail-in balloting has been embraced by older Pennsylvanians?
Well, we know that 61% of older Pennsylvanians say they're going to vote in person on Election Day, and that 28% of older voters in the state and the Commonwealth say that they're going to vote absentee or by mail. 7% say they'll vote in person but do it early. And so most voters are still wanting to go to the polls on Election Day as they have in the past.
That's got to come with a certain rewarding feeling when you see people you know, and like Bill said, you're pulling a switch on a machine. You're getting more involved. You're not sitting at home by yourself at a computer.
There's that aspect, and I think the other thing too is that, as you mentioned, Larry, it is fairly new. There's a lot of skepticism, there are some candidates that are saying that don't go to mail-in ballot. Make sure that you're on Election Day, you're there physically in the booth. So I think people are listening to that, and they have to get comfortable with knowing that their vote is going to count if they do it by mail-in ballot.
And some of the candidates themselves have to get comfortable too. Some who were opposed to it now are embracing it.
Some, yes.
And if getting to the polls poses that challenge, what can older voters do? I mean, especially from your point of view at AARP, some people want to get there for that community experience, and maybe there's difficulty. Is there transportation? You got any tips for them, Bill?
At AARP, we don't provide transportation, but there are a lot of groups out there that do that, that help people get to the voting place on Election Day.
And people have to know they're there.
They have to know that they're there, and local communities are very good, and different groups that are out there, like the League of Women Voters and some others, both the parties, the Republican Party and Democratic Party, they make sure that people have the right and have the transportation to be able to go and cast their ballot.
Jeff and Bob, we're getting ready to wrap up our show here. What was the most surprising development in this poll? Start with you, Jeff.
You know, I'll say that we hear a lot about how divided our country is. And certainly there are divisions in Pennsylvania and within the older electorate, but there's also a lot that unites us. And if you look at an issue like Social Security, an issue like family caregiving, an issue like Medicare negotiating lower prescription drug prices, you have broad agreement across party lines on those issues.
Bob, did you see something in the poll that shook you up?
Well, I think the number of older Pennsylvanians who are relying on Social Security because they say it's a major source of their income. Among seniors in Pennsylvania, 73% say that Social Security is a major source of their income. And so, you know, when you're on a fixed income and these rising prices are at the top of the list, you know, it's helpful for candidates to see numbers like that to really put it in perspective. That, you know, older voters are really counting on their Social Security, and how rising prices, you know, negatively impacts their fixed income budgets.
Bill, I'm going to give you the last word on this. What was the major takeaway for AARP after this poll?
The major takeaway really is that older Pennsylvanians vote. And that Pennsylvania is a pivotal battleground state, and whoever wants to get in to the White House, get into elected office at the state level here, or the U.S. Senate, is going to have to listen to the issues that are impacting older Pennsylvanians. And if you want to be an elected official, this is the group that you have to listen to. And all these different elected officials will be going through Pennsylvania to get their jobs, in my opinion.
Our guests have been Bob Ward of Fabrizio Ward, Jeff Liszt from Impact Research, and Bill Johnston-Walsh, the State Director of AARP Pennsylvania. Thanks, everyone. That's it for Focus on Aging Adults. I'm Larry Casper. Thanks for watching.
Focus on Aging Adults is sponsored in part by AARP.